Hi, welcome to our channel where we share the most intriguing stories. James Brown cherished the quiet of his suburban cul-de-sac, where life revolved around his family, a wide driveway, and peaceful routines. But when his reckless neighbor Carla threw a chaotic birthday party for her cocky boyfriend, chaos erupted, threatening everything James had worked so hard to protect. James Brown had always taken pride in the serene suburban life he'd built with his wife Emily and their two children, 12-year-old Emmett and 8-year-old Sarah. Their cozy home, nestled at the edge of a quiet cul-de-sac, felt like a haven from the chaos of the outside world. With a neatly trimmed lawn, a sprawling backyard, and a wide driveway that could easily fit 4 cars, James had every reason to believe he had found the perfect spot to raise his family. The driveway was more than just a convenience. It was a cornerstone of their daily lives. It was where Sarah practiced drawing chalk murals, Emmett fine-tuned his bicycle tricks, and the family gathered to load up for road trips or unload groceries after a busy weekend. James had poured his heart into making the property not just functional, but welcoming, planting flowers along the edges, and maintaining the pavement with military precision, a habit he'd carried over from his years in the Marine Corps. Yet, no neighborhood is without its quirks, and for the Browns, that came in the form of Carla Henderson. At 29 years old, Carla was the very definition of a wild card. A party enthusiast with a penchant for loud music and late nights, she had a knack for turning the otherwise peaceful cul-de-sac into a hub of chaos. A few years earlier, one of her infamous parties had spiraled out of control, ending with police cars lining the street, neighbors shouting, and James himself stepping outside with his shotgun to scare off rowdy partygoers banging on doors in the middle of the night. That night, Carla had crossed a line, and James had made sure she understood it. Since then, Carla had kept a wary distance. While her parties didn't entirely cease, she had learned to keep the volume lower and the disruptions minimal. James had installed security cameras around his property shortly after the incident, not out of paranoia, but as a safeguard for his family. Over time, James found himself softening toward Carla. She was young, after all, with an apparent inability to grasp the consequences of her actions. But Emily often reminded him, with a wry smile, that young was a generous term for someone pushing 30. Recently, though, Carla's notorious energy seemed to have settled. For the past 6 months, the cul-de-sac had been uncharacteristically quiet. James suspected it had something to do with a new development in Carla's life. A boyfriend. Ronnie was his name, a wiry 25-year-old with a cocky demeanor and a perpetual smirk. From what James could tell, Ronnie wasn't exactly a catch. He dressed sloppily, drove an old pickup truck with a noisy muffler, and had a habit of loitering outside Carla's house, always seeming to glare at anyone who passed by. Over dinner, James often speculated with Emily about what Carla could possibly see in Ronnie. Maybe she's just ready to settle down, Emily would offer, though her tone carried skepticism. James wasn't so sure. While he didn't particularly like Carla or her choice in partners, he appreciated the quiet that had accompanied Ronnie's presence. At least, for now, it seemed she had traded in wild parties for quiet nights with her peculiar boyfriend. But things began to change one Saturday morning when James noticed Carla and a group of her friends bustling around her front yard. They were decorating. Streamers hung from the porch, balloons bobbed in the wind, and a banner was being carefully unfurled across her garage door. James paused by the window, his curiosity piqued. Emily joined him, her coffee cup in hand. "Looks like someone's having a party," she said, raising an eyebrow. "Yeah," James replied, watching as Carla laughed and chatted with her friends. "Probably for Ronnie. That guy seems like the kind to demand a whole event for his birthday." Emily chuckled. "Let's hope they remember to keep it down this time." James grunted in agreement, his mind already flashing back to the last time Carla threw a party. Despite her recent efforts to stay out of trouble, a sense of unease settled over him. Still, he shrugged it off. "Maybe she's finally learned her lesson," he muttered, heading back to his toolbox in the garage. For the rest of the day, James tried to focus on his tasks, but the sight of balloons floating in the corner of his vision kept pulling his thoughts back to Carla's house. By the time he left for work the next afternoon, he found himself hoping that his quiet cul-de-sac wouldn't transform into a scene of chaos once again. He reminded himself that Carla seemed to have matured and that even if things went south, he had security cameras and a level head to keep his family safe. Little did he know, the peace he cherished was about to shatter in ways he never imagined. The day after James noticed the decorations, the cul-de-sac was buzzing with activity. Cars began arriving at Carla's house around noon, lining the curb as guests unloaded supplies, and laughter filled the air. James, leaving for a shift downtown, glanced at the growing number of vehicles and sighed. The party preparations were in full swing, but he consoled himself with the hope that Carla would keep things under control. After all, she had been quiet for months, and maybe this would be a relatively tame gathering. As he drove past her house, he caught a glimpse of Ronnie gesturing animatedly to a friend while pointing toward the street. Carla, dressed in a festive outfit, was hanging more decorations, her friends helping her set up tables and chairs in the yard. James rolled his eyes and muttered, "Let's see if maturity holds up for one night." Later that evening, as James wrapped up work, his phone buzzed. Emily was calling, but the connection was spotty. All he could hear was her panicked voice, muffled by sobs, as she tried to explain something about people outside the house. "They're shouting, the driveway, throwing things," were the only words James could make out before the call dropped. His heart sank. Without a second thought, he grabbed his keys and sped home, his mind racing with worst-case scenarios. As James approached his street, his headlights illuminated chaos. His driveway was packed with at least 7 cars, their tires pressed into the edges of his meticulously maintained lawn. A crowd of about 10 people stood in the yard, hurling rocks and yelling obscenities toward the house. Some were laughing, while others gestured aggressively at the windows. The sight of Emmett's mangled bicycle lying discarded in the middle of the road sent a surge of anger coursing through James. Pulling over near the curb, James was greeted by his neighbor Joe, who had rushed over to help. Joe's arm was wrapped in a makeshift sling, his face bruised and smeared with dirt. "James, thank God you're here," Joe panted. "I tried calling you. These punks showed up, parked all over your driveway, and started demanding to see you. I stepped in, and, well, they didn't like that." James clenched his fists, fury bubbling beneath the surface. "Where's Emily?" "The kids," he demanded. Joe pointed to the house. "They're inside. I told them to lock the doors and stay low. The police are on their way, but they're taking forever." James scanned the crowd, his eyes locking onto Ronnie, who was standing near the front of the group, shouting loudest of all. His arrogant smirk made James's blood boil. He marched straight toward him, ignoring Joe's warning to wait for the police. As James approached, Ronnie noticed him and grinned mockingly. "Finally, the man of the hour. Your little brat messed up my car, and now you're going to pay for it." He sneered. He scratched the paint, and then, before Ronnie could finish, James, unable to contain his fury, threw a punch that sent the younger man sprawling onto the lawn. The crowd froze, momentarily stunned by the outburst, before several of Ronnie's friends stepped forward menacingly. But before any further violence could erupt, flashing blue and red lights bathed the scene. 3 police cruisers screeched to a halt, and officers jumped out, shouting commands. "Everyone on the ground! Hands where we can see them!" James raised his hands, stepping back as the officers moved in. Neighbors emerged from their homes, shouting accounts of what had happened and pointing to the troublemakers. Police began cuffing the rowdy guests, while others assessed the damage to James's property. Relief washed over James as he saw Emily and the kids peeking cautiously from the front door. He gave them a reassuring nod, knowing the nightmare wasn't over, but grateful the situation hadn't spiraled further. The flashing lights of police cruisers illuminated the chaos as James stood near his driveway, catching his breath. The officers worked swiftly, dispersing the crowd and cuffing several of the most belligerent troublemakers, including Ronnie, who was still sprawled on the lawn nursing a bloody lip. James watched silently, his fury still simmering, but tempered by the sight of law enforcement taking control. His mind, however, was racing with the implications of what had just happened. As the officers began asking questions, one of them, Officer Grant, approached James. "Sir, we're going to need a statement. Can you tell us what led up to this?" James nodded, gesturing toward the house. "Let me check on my wife and kids first. They've been through hell tonight." James hurried to the front door, where Emily stood with their children huddled close. She threw her arms around him as tears streamed down her face. "They were everywhere, James," she whispered shakily. "They wouldn't leave. no matter how much I begged. Emmett tried to stand up to them, but that just made things worse. James looked down at his son, who had a mixture of defiance and fear in his eyes. "What happened, buddy?" he asked, his voice soft. Emmett hesitated before speaking. "I was riding my bike home when I saw all those cars in our driveway. I tried to tell them to move, but one guy started yelling at me. He grabbed my bike, so I kicked him and ran inside." His voice wavered. "I didn't mean to make things worse." James knelt down, placing a firm hand on his son's shoulder. "You didn't do anything wrong. This isn't your fault." He felt his anger reignite, but he knew he needed to stay focused. Returning to Officer Grant, James began recounting the events. He described how the trouble had started with Ronnie's guests parking on his property and escalated into threats and vandalism. "My security cameras should have caught everything," James added. "I'll pull the footage for you." As James retrieved the video files, another officer approached with updates. "We've detained most of the group. It looks like some of them had been drinking heavily, which explains their behavior. But this Ronnie guy, he's insisting your son damaged his car and started the fight." James narrowed his eyes. "My son is 12 years old. Whatever happened, these adults had no right to storm my property or threaten my family." Officer Grant nodded. "We'll sort it out, sir. But I'll be honest with you. This might escalate into a legal battle, depending on what the footage shows." James connected his security system to a laptop and played the video for the officers. The footage revealed everything. Ronnie directing his friends to park on James's driveway, Emily confronting the group and being dismissed with mocking laughter, and finally, Emmett's encounter. The video showed a man grabbing Emmett's bike and yelling at him before the boy kicked him and ran inside. It also captured the man smashing the bike in retaliation, an act that sent a fresh wave of anger through James as he watched. The officers exchanged glances as the recording continued. The subsequent footage showed Joe attempting to intervene, only to be shoved aside as the mob grew bolder, throwing rocks and yelling insults at the house. It was damning evidence. "Well," Officer Grant said after the video ended, "this pretty much confirms your side of the story. We'll need copies for our investigation." James handed over the files without hesitation. "Take whatever you need. I just want them held accountable." Outside, the scene had quieted. Ronnie and his cohort sat on the curb in handcuffs, looking visibly less cocky than before. Carla, who had emerged from her house only after the police arrived, stood off to the side, clutching her phone with a pale, anxious expression. James approached her, his voice calm but steely. "This is on you, Carla. You let these people turn our neighborhood into a war zone." She opened her mouth to protest but quickly closed it, her eyes darting to the officers nearby. For once, she had nothing to say. As tow trucks began arriving to haul away the illegally parked cars, James surveyed the damage. Broken windows, smashed flower pots, and debris littering his once pristine lawn. The sight hardened his resolve. This wasn't just a fight for his property, it was a fight to reclaim the safety of his family and the integrity of his neighborhood. By the time the last police cruiser drove away, James stood alone in the driveway, the weight of the night settling over him. He knew this was far from over, but he was ready for the battles ahead. The following days were a whirlwind of police reports, neighborhood whispers, and mounting tension. James worked closely with Officer Grant and his team to ensure every detail of the incident was documented. The footage from his security cameras became a key piece of evidence, painting a clear picture of the night's events and leaving little room for Ronnie or his friends to dispute their actions. Within 48 hours, formal charges were filed against Ronnie and 17 others who had participated in the chaos. These included trespassing, vandalism, making threats, and destruction of private property. Carla, though not directly involved in the physical confrontation, faced her own set of charges for allowing the party to spiral out of control. Her decision to stay inside while the mob wreaked havoc outside only worsened her case. Meanwhile, James was inundated with support from neighbors. Joe, still nursing his injured arm, stopped by to thank James for standing his ground. "I think this was the wake-up call our neighborhood needed," he said. Gloria, an elderly neighbor from 3 houses down, also came over with cookies for James's family. "I'm so glad someone finally stood up to her," she said, her voice trembling. "We've all been too scared to say anything for years." The neighborhood's quiet solidarity soon turned into active involvement. Several residents submitted their own statements to the police, recounting past incidents with Carla's unruly guests. Some even shared stories of being harassed or threatened, building a stronger case against the troublemakers. The local media caught wind of the story, and soon headlines like "Suburban Nightmare," "Mob Storms Family Home in Parking Dispute" began circulating. At home, James focused on rebuilding. Contractors replaced the broken windows, repaired the damaged lawn, and cleared away debris. Emmett's bike, now beyond repair, was replaced with a newer model, courtesy of Joe and a few other neighbors who had pitched in. The gesture brought tears to Emily's eyes. "At least something good is coming out of this," she said, hugging James. As the legal process unfolded, the consequences for Ronnie and his group became clear. A preliminary court hearing revealed the severity of their actions, with the prosecution presenting the security footage and multiple witness statements. The judge, visibly unimpressed by their behavior, denied bail for several key offenders, including Ronnie, citing them as a threat to the community. Carla, facing both criminal charges and public scrutiny, began to crumble under the pressure. She put her house on the market and disappeared from the neighborhood almost overnight, leaving behind whispers of disgrace and relief among the neighbors. The once chaotic house at the end of the street now stood empty, a stark reminder of the havoc she had allowed. For James, the resolution wasn't just about justice, it was about peace. One evening, as the sun set over his now restored lawn, Emily joined him on the porch. "Think it's over?" she asked. James nodded, his gaze steady. "It's over for now. And if it isn't, we'll be ready." The dust from the incident began to settle, but the ripple effects on the neighborhood were only beginning to take shape. For the first time in years, the residents of the cul-de-sac felt a collective sense of empowerment. The mob's brazen attack on James's property had shaken the entire community, but his resilience and the swift police response had inspired action among the neighbors. Carla's sudden departure marked a turning point. Her house was quickly listed for sale, and the once lively parties and commotion that had plagued the street were replaced by an almost eerie calm. Neighbors began reaching out to one another in ways they hadn't before. People who had previously stayed behind closed doors to avoid trouble now felt emboldened to speak up about their own experiences with Carla's antics. James's family became the unofficial symbol of the neighborhood's resurgence. The footage from his security cameras not only brought justice, but also served as a reminder of the importance of standing up for one's rights. Emily noticed a shift almost immediately. When she walked Sarah to school or Emmett rode his new bike down the street, neighbors would wave, smile, or even stop to chat. A stark contrast to the quiet avoidance of just weeks earlier. At a neighborhood meeting held a few weeks later, James and Emily were surprised to see nearly every household represented. Joe, still bandaged but in high spirits, opened the gathering by thanking James for his leadership during the crisis. "He reminded us that we don't have to tolerate bad behavior," Joe said, earning nods and applause. The discussion quickly turned to how the community could ensure such an incident never happened again. Suggestions included forming a neighborhood watch, establishing clear property boundaries, and installing additional lighting along the street to deter future disturbances. Emily proposed organizing regular gatherings to foster better relationships among neighbors, and the idea was met with enthusiasm. One of the most surprising outcomes came from Gloria, the elderly woman who had always kept a low profile. "You've given us our street back, James," she said during the meeting, her voice filled with gratitude. "I've lived here for 30 years, and I can't remember the last time we all felt this united." As the weeks turned into months, the changes became more evident. The neighborhood developed a stronger sense of community, with residents supporting each other in small but meaningful ways. Joe helped Gloria fix her squeaky gate, while Emily and James organized a barbecue for the entire block. Emmett and Sarah even made new friends, playing with other kids in the neighborhood who had once been too intimidated by Carla's chaotic environment to venture outside. When Carla's house finally sold, it was to a quiet, friendly couple eager to settle into the transformed community. They joined the neighborhood's newfound camaraderie almost immediately, hosting a small housewarming party that stood in stark contrast to the wild events that had once defined that property. For James, the positive shift was a reminder that standing up against injustice often leads to more than just a personal victory. One evening, as he and Emily relaxed on their porch, she reflected on how far things had come. "It's strange," she said. "What started as such a nightmare ended up making this place feel more like home than ever." James smiled, glancing at the driveway where Emmett was teaching Sarah how to ride a bike. The scars of that chaotic night had faded, replaced by something much stronger, a community finally united by the determination to protect what they valued most. The events that had once turned James's world upside down now felt like a distant memory. Life in the cul-de-sac had returned to its peaceful rhythm, and the scars left behind, both physical and emotional, had begun to heal. The house that once belonged to Carla, a source of chaos for so many years, now stood as a symbol of change. Its new owners, a young couple with 2 children, had quickly blended into the neighborhood, their friendly demeanor a stark contrast to the disruption that had come before. For James, the ordeal was more than just a confrontation over property. It had become a lesson in resilience, community, and the power of standing firm. Sitting on the porch one quiet afternoon, Emily joined him, holding 2 mugs of steaming coffee. "You know," she said, breaking the silence, "I wasn't sure we'd ever feel safe here again. But now, it feels like home again." James nodded, his eyes scanning the driveway, now free of unwanted cars and chaos. "It's not just us," he replied. "This whole street feels different. It's like we've all been reminded that we're stronger together." Emily smiled. "Do you think it's over?" she asked, though her tone carried no fear, only curiosity. James chuckled. "I think we've earned some peace, and if anything ever happens again, we know exactly what to do." The transformation of the neighborhood was undeniable. The barbecue James and Emily had hosted had become a catalyst for a new era of camaraderie. Neighbors who had once stayed isolated now regularly greeted one another, shared tools, and watched out for each other's homes. Joe, still a close friend, had even organized a block-wide email chain to keep everyone connected and informed. The legal proceedings against Carla, Ronnie, and the others had concluded weeks earlier, with severe penalties handed down to the offenders. Ronnie and several of his friends were serving prison sentences for their roles in the vandalism and threats, while Carla, having paid hefty fines and faced public embarrassment, had relocated to another state. Her departure left behind a sense of relief, but also a clear reminder of what unchecked behavior could lead to. For Emmett and Sarah, life had also taken a positive turn. Emmett's confidence had grown since the incident, and he proudly rode his new bike up and down the street, often alongside other neighborhood kids who had once been strangers. Sarah, inspired by the renewed sense of community, had begun creating chalk murals at the end of the driveway, where neighbors often stopped to admire her colorful designs. One sunny Saturday, James stood in the driveway watching Emmett and Sarah play, the warmth of the sun reflecting off the freshly restored pavement. A group of neighbors walked by, waving as they passed. James waved back, a deep sense of pride swelling in his chest. The neighborhood had become what he'd always hoped it could be: safe, supportive, and united. That evening, Emily brought out a plate of cookies, setting them on the porch table as the family gathered to watch the sunset. "You know," she said thoughtfully, "this place isn't just where we live. It's where we've built something stronger than a house or a yard. It's where we've built trust." James looked at her and nodded. "And it's worth fighting for." As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a golden glow over the street, James felt an overwhelming sense of peace. His home was more than just a physical space. It was a reflection of his perseverance and the power of a community that had come together when it mattered most.